Hello, I am doing a Rudie solo. I got these trinkets as a randomizer, so I'm pretty lucky here. Is it just me, or does the skin look like Bambi? What the hell? Am I going to? Okay. Do. Leave me alone. I just realized I'm not supposed to buy on randomizer ones.
And for the children who did not come home. It began with the rain. In the autumn of 1957, a massive storm system stalled over the state of Maine. The clouds were thick and dark grey like bruises on the sky. The rain fell for days without stopping. It was a cold, hard rain that stripped the last of the coloured leaves from the trees and turned the ground into mud. The Kenduskeag stream, which was usually a lazy flow of water, began to rise. It turned brown and angry. It chewed at its banks. The water level crept up the concrete sides of the canal in the downtown area. The drains in the streets could not handle the volume of water. They backed up. Leaves and trash clogged the grates. The streets became shallow rivers. During this flood on a dark afternoon, a young boy named George Denbrough went outside to play. He was wearing a yellow raincoat and red rain boots. He had a boat made of newspaper that his brother had made for him. He placed the boat in the gutter where the rainwater was rushing like a torrent. He ran alongside it laughing. The boat moved fast, carried by the current. It headed toward a storm drain at the corner of Jackson and Witcham streets. The drain was dark. It was a gaping mouth in the curb. The boat went over the edge and into the darkness. George knelt down to look for it. And there, in the darkness of the sewer under the street, he met the entity. The death of George Denbrough was the spark that ignited the 1957 cycle. It was not an accident. It was a sacrifice. The town did not see it that way, of course. They saw a tragic accident. They found the body, but they did not find the arm. They held a funeral, but the fear had started. The entity was awake, and it was feeding. That summer was a season of terror for the children of Derry. To the adults, it was just a summer of bad luck. There were curfews, there were warnings to stay away from the barrens. But the adults were foggy. They were distracted. They went to work, and they mowed their lawns and they watched the news, but they did not really see what was happening. They did not see the red balloons tied to the bridge. They did not hear the voices coming from the sink drains. The apathy that covered Derry was like a thick wool blanket. It muffled the screams. The geography of the town played a crucial role in this cycle. The Barrens was the centre of it all. The thick vegetation provided cover. The pumping stations for the sewer system were located there, massive concrete cylinders that hummed with the power of the machinery inside. The children, who would later be known as the Losers Club, spent their time in the Barrens. They built a dam in the stream. They built an underground clubhouse. They were trying to claim the land back from the monster. They were trying to create a safe space in hostile geography. There was a place in the Barrens called the Gravel Pit. It was in scarred, open area where the earth had been dug out for construction. It was a place of violence. The local bullies, who were just as much a part of the town's evil as the monster, used the gravel pit to hurt other children. They threw rocks, they broke arms. The violence of the children mirrored the violence of the history. It was the same energy that had caused the massacre at the lumber camp and the shooting of the Bradley gang. It was the town acting out its nature through its people. The cycle of 1957 ended in confrontation deep beneath the city. The details of this are not recorded in the newspapers. The police reports only show that the murders stopped. The missing children were never found. The town simply let out a long breath and went back to sleep. The rain stopped. The floodwaters receded, leaving behind a layer of silt and mud on the streets. The entity had been hurt, but it had not been killed. It retreated deep into the mangroveverse, deep into the dark stone beneath the town to heal. For the next 27 years, Derry was quiet. This period, from 1958 to 1984, was a time of the town did not grow much. It felt like a place that was waiting. People who grew up there usually moved away as soon as they could. They felt an urge to leave, to get out of the shadow of the standpipe. And when they left, they forgot. They forgot the names of their friends. They forgot the specific quality of the light in the afternoon. It was a supernatural amnesia. Only those who stayed remembered, and even their memories were hazy. One man stayed. Mike Hanlon became the librarian of Derry. The library was spent his life collecting the stories of the town. He looked at the old photographs and the newspaper clippings. He saw the pattern. He saw the face of the entity in the background of pictures from the ironworks explosion and the Bradley gang shootout. He saw the balloon man at the fair. He wrote the history that the town wanted to forget. He was the keeper of the lighthouse, waiting for the storm to return. And return it did. In 1984, the wheel clicked into place again. The 27 years were up. The awakening began with violence, as it always did. A young man named Adrian Mellon was walking home from a fair. He was a gay man living in a town that did not accept him. He was attacked by 3 local men on the bridge over the Kenduskeag stream. They beat him. They threw him over the railing into the water below. This event mirrors the burning of the Black Spot. It was a hate crime fueled by the intolerance of the town. The men who threw him over were the agents of the evil, just like the Legion had been decades before. But what happened under the bridge was the work of the entity. Adrian Mellon did not die from the fall. He was dragged out of the water by the shaking darkness. He was consumed. The town was awake again. The year of 1985 was the final year of the old Derry. The events that followed would physically change the map of the town forever. The group of friends who had fought the monster in the 50s returned. They came back because of a promise, but also because the town pulled them back. The gravity of Derry is strong. It pulls on the souls of those who have been touched by it. The climax of this history is known as the Great Storm of 1985. It was not just a weather event, it was a psychic event that manifested as weather. As the entity was fought deep in the tunnels beneath the city, the town above began to die. It was as if the city and the monster were the same organism. If one died, the other had to die too. The storm began in the morning. The sky turned a color that no one had ever seen before. It was a bruised purple and black. The wind howled through the streets, tearing shingles off the roofs and knocking down the old elm trees that lined the avenues. The power went out. The rain fell in sheets so thick that you could not see the house across the street. The standpipe was the first major casualty. This white tower had stood on the hill for nearly a century. It was the reservoir for the town, holding millions of gallons of water. It was a symbol of the town's pride. But as the entity screamed in the dark below, the standpipe began to crack. People watching from their windows saw fissures appear in the white concrete. The water pressure inside became too much. With a sound like a bomb going off, the standpipe exploded. Millions of gallons of water rushed down the hill. It was a tidal wave in the middle of the town. The water smashed into the houses at the bottom of the hill. It tore up the pavement. It joined the rising waters of the Kenduskeag stream, which had already burst its banks. The park in the centre of town was submerged. The statue of Paul Bunyan, which stood near the centre, was buffeted by the wind, and the water looking like a giant helpless in the face of the destruction. But the water was not the only thing. The earth itself gave way. The downtown area began to collapse. Sinkholes opened up in the middle of Main Street. Buildings that had stood for 100 years crumbled into dust. The shops, the pharmacy, the movie theatre, they all began to slide into the ground. It was as if the hollow tunnels beneath the city could no longer support the weight of the lies above them. The infrastructure that had been built to hide the monster was failing. The flood of 1985 destroyed a large part of Derry. When the wind finally died down and the rain stopped, the town looked like a war zone. The downtown was a ruin of mud and broken brick. The canal was choked with debris. The standpipe was gone, leaving only a jagged stump on the hill. The entity was dead, or at least the physical form of it was destroyed. The heartbeat that had thumped beneath the floorboards for millions of years had stopped. But a town does not just end. The history of Derry continued into the 1990s, but it was a different kind of history. The town was rebuilding, new buildings went up, the debris was cleared away, but the atmosphere had changed. The heavy, oppressive feeling was gone, but it was replaced by something else, a feeling of emptiness, a feeling of a place that had lost its center. In the early 90s, specifically around 1993 and 94, strange things began to happen again. This is the era recorded in the historical account known as insomnia. An old man named Ralph Roberts began to see things. He was not sleeping well. He began to see colors around people. He called them auras. He saw that people who were sick or dying had different colors. He saw little men in white coats who he called the little bald doctors. This period revealed that Derry was not just the home of the monster It. Derry was a thin spot in reality. It was a place where the barriers between worlds were weak. Even with the monster gone, the weakness remained. The Crimson King, another force of chaos in the universe, had agents in the town. They were trying to use the town's unique geography to attack the structure of the universe itself, which is often referred to as the Tower. The Derry of the 90s was a place of political tension. There was a large pro-choice rally and a women's shelter that became a target for extremists. The violence was no longer supernatural in the way it had been with the monster. It was human violence. It was political and angry. The town was trying to find a new identity, but it kept falling back into old habits of hate and division. The community centre became a focal point for this conflict. During this time, the geography of the town was still scarred. The area where the standpipe had been was now a memorial park. It was a quiet place, but few people went there. The depression in the ground where it stood was like a footprint of a ghost. The barrens were still there, wild and overgrown, but the sense of immediate danger was less. The stream flowed clear. As we move into the 21st century, the history of Derry becomes a series of echoes. The town is mentioned in other historical records. In the account known as Dreamcatcher, there is a massive alien incursion in the woods north of Derry. The military quarantined the entire area. They put a fence around the zone. Derry was once again on the edge of a disaster. The survivors of that event remembered the town. They remembered the standpipe and the feeling of the sewers. They saw a plaque that had been erected in the town. The plaque was a memorial to the victims of the 1957 storm and the 1985 flood, but someone had defaced it. Scrawled across the memorial in red paint were the words "Pennywise Lives." This graffiti raises the ultimate historical question.
Now, I heard a woo. Do we have people in the house from the UK? All right, let me tell the rest of the people about you. I love it whenever people from the UK come here to the United States, because when we hear you speak, you sound incredible, you sound amazing, you sound educated, you sound inspirational. That accent is so proper. It is so proper. It doesn't matter what you're talking about. We're drawn to whatever it is. You could be talking about trash. It sounds amazing.
Who could leave all this rubbish here? This is such a travesty. There's all this destruction here all over the sidewalk. Someone must tend to this.
Guy from England is
Yes, I don't know.
See, it's very different. Now, when one of us goes over there, man, it's very, very different. Because, see, we don't sound the same as them. As a matter of fact, as Americans, we have a certain way with the English language. Do you understand how we sound to them? I mean, seriously, do you know how they look at us when they hear us speak? We sound like this to them.
I'll tell you right now, the other day I was hanging out with Phil, right? They come next door to the house. We had ourselves a good old time. It was me and Phil.
And by the way, if you sound like that here tonight, I'm just kidding. We're just, don't feel like this, you know.
I'm gonna wait for his ass outside. I'll see how funny he is when he gets back.
whoa. Do we have people in the house from the UK? All right, let me tell the rest of the...
Some houses are so strange that no one wants them, no matter the price. These bizarre homes have been sitting on the market for years.
There's a castle in Transylvania. Hello, listener. The fact you hear this means you're alive. If you're new here, consider subscribing and comment below where you're listening from. Let's begin the story. My name is Crosby Vale, and 5 years ago I built a small cabin on a lake island because I needed a place that stayed quiet even when life got loud. The divorce papers were signed. The town felt suffocating, and weekends had turned into a blur of forced small talk that didn't fix anything. Out there, it was simple mechanics. One room, a cast iron wood stove, a sturdy table, 2 chairs, and a narrow bunk.
In the winter of 1379, a woman named Eleanor stood alone in a tiny cell deep beneath a castle in northern France, listening to the sound of masons working above her. She had been 23 years old when they brought her here 6 days ago. She had been a nobleman's wife, educated, refined, accused of something she swore she had never done. For 6 days she had heard the sounds of construction, hammering, scraping, the voices of men working. On the 7th day, the sound stopped. The door to her cell opened, and the masons entered.
Here's the thing, managing clients, products, and life all at once is a lot, especially when your share and your calendar are always full. Intuit QuickBooks connects your data, gives you access to AI, and helps you track and complete tasks, so you can make confident decisions and scale your business even on the go.
It tracks what's coming in and what's going out, right on the QuickBooks mobile app, because your business doesn't pause when you step away from the chair. That's confident growth, backed by AI. Outdo it with Intuit QuickBooks.
Eleanor asked them what they were doing. They would not answer. They began building a wall across the opening of her cell, sealing her inside. Eleanor screamed. She begged them to stop. She pleaded to speak to someone, anyone, to explain that this was a mistake, that she was innocent. The masons worked in silence, laying stone upon stone, mixing mortar, building the wall higher. As the wall rose to chest height, Eleanor could still see out into the corridor. She saw the castle steward watching from a distance. She called to him, reminded him that she had known him since childhood, begged him to stop this. He turned and walked away. The wall continued to rise. When it reached Eleanor's shoulders, she realized what was happening. They were sealing her in. They were burying her alive in this cell beneath the castle. She would die here in the darkness, slowly, alone, and no one would stop it because her husband had accused her of adultery, and in medieval Europe, a husband's word was law. But before I tell you what happened to Eleanor in that sealed
First
cell,
which is now this.
before I tell you whether she survived or how long she lasted, before I reveal the full horror of what medieval society did to women accused of adultery, I need to tell you about other women whose fates were just as terrible, whose stories reveal a system of punishment so brutal that it's almost impossible to believe it happened in Christian Europe. Because what happened to Eleanor was not unique. It was one method among dozens that medieval courts and communities used to destroy women accused of betraying their husbands. And by the end of this video, when I tell you what ultimately happened to Eleanor in that cell, you will understand that medieval Europe's treatment of accused adulteresses was worse than execution, worse than torture, worse than anything most people can imagine. This is the story of the most horrific punishments for cheating wives in medieval Europe. And I need you to understand from the beginning that everything I describe is documented in historical records, in court documents, in church archives, in chronicles written by medieval people themselves. These are not legends or exaggerations. These are real punishments that happened to real women, recorded by the very societies that carried them out. If you want to understand how entire civilizations can normalize systematic violence against women, how accusations become weapons more deadly than swords, how gender-based terror can be woven into the fabric of law and custom, then you need to watch this entire video. Subscribe to this channel right now because we're about to go deep into one of the darkest chapters of human history. Hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Now, let me tell you about Marjorie, because her story shows you how these punishments actually work in practice, and because what happened to her will help you understand what was waiting for Eleanor in that sealed cell. In the spring of 1342, a woman named Marjorie stood in the village square of a small town in Yorkshire, England, while the blacksmith heated an iron rod in his forge until it glowed orange-red with heat. Marjorie was 31 years old, married for 14 years to a wool merchant named Thomas, who traveled frequently for business. He had been accused of adultery with a young baker named Rudie. The evidence was circumstantial at best, almost laughably thin. A neighbor claimed to have seen William entering Marjorie's home while Thomas was away on his business trip. Another neighbor said she had heard laughter coming from inside the house. That was the entire case this morning. A man entered her home during daylight hours, possibly to deliver bread. Someone heard laughter. From this, an entire community concluded that Marjorie was an adulteress who deserved punishment. Marjorie had not been allowed to defend herself in any meaningful way. She had not been permitted to speak at the trial held by the local Lord's Court. Her accuser was her husband, Thomas himself. And under medieval law throughout most of Europe, a husband's testimony about his wife's behavior carried absolute weight. His word was truth. His interpretation of events was reality. Thomas had found out about William's visit to the neighborhood blacksmith that had reached him while he was conducting business. A fellow merchant had mentioned with smirking sympathy that people back home were talking about Thomas's wife entertaining the baker. Thomas had not witnessed any impropriety himself. He had no evidence beyond the gossip. But the damage to his honor, the public humiliation of being potentially cuckolded, the whispers and knowing looks from other men, these demanded action. His reputation as a man depended entirely on his ability to control his wife, to ensure her absolute fidelity, to punish her publicly and severely if she strayed, or even if she appeared to stray. In medieval society, a man who could not control his wife was not a man at all. He was a cuckold, a figure of mockery and contempt, someone who had failed at the most basic duty of manhood. Now Marjorie stood with her hands bound behind her back, while the entire village gathered to watch her punishment. The gathering was not optional. The Lord's bailiff had gone through the village that morning, announcing that all residents were required to attend the punishment of the adulteress Marjorie, wife of Thomas the wool merchant. Attendance was mandatory because these punishments were not just about punishing the individual. They were about teaching the entire community a lesson, about reinforcing social order, about showing every wife what would happen if she stepped out of line, and showing every husband that the law supported his absolute authority. The blacksmith removed the glowing iron from the forge, holding it carefully with heavy tongs. It was a simple rod, about 6 inches long and 1 inch wide, with a flat end that had been carefully shaped into the letter A for adulteress. The shaping had been done the previous day while Marjorie sat in a cell beneath the manor house. listening to the sound of metal being hammered, and knowing that iron was being prepared to mark her flesh permanently. Marjorie could feel the heat radiating from the metal as the blacksmith approached her, the rod glowing bright orange, waves of heat distorting the air around her. She tried to back away, an instinctive recoil from the approaching agony. The two men stepped forward and grabbed her arms, holding her firmly in place. One of them was her own cousin, a man she had known her entire life, but his face showed no sympathy, no doubt only a grim determination to do his duty as a member of the community enforcing justice. The blacksmith positioned himself directly in front of Marjorie. He looked into her eyes for just a moment. Was that pity, apology, or simply the cold efficiency of a craftsman about to perform a task? Then pressed the glowing iron against Marjorie's left cheek. The sizzle of burning flesh was audible across the entire square. It sounded like meat being seared on a hot pan, sharp and stomach-turning. Marjorie screamed, the sound of such pure, undiluted agony that it seemed to come from somewhere deeper in her throat, torn from her very soul. The scream echoed off the buildings surrounding the square, bouncing back and forth, filling the air with the sound of her suffering. The smell of burning flesh filled the air, acrid, nauseating, making several people in the crowd turn away or cover their noses. But most watched with grim fascination, their faces showing a mixture of righteous satisfaction, vicarious horror, and perhaps relief that they were standing in the crowd rather than being held at the center of it. The blacksmith held the iron in place for several seconds. It must have felt like hours to Marjorie, ensuring the brand would be deep enough to scar permanently, clear enough to be read easily, marking her forever. When he finally removed the iron, Marjorie collapsed. Her legs no longer able to support her weight. She sobbed and gasped, her hands still bound behind her back so she could not even touch her face or try to ease the burning pain. The letter A was burned into her left cheek, about 2 inches high, the flesh charred black in the center, red, blistering skin in the blood mixed with clear fluid oozed from her wound. Everyone who saw her for the rest of her life would know immediately what she had done, or what she had been accused of doing. She would never be able to hide her shame. She would never be able to start over somewhere else where people did not know existed. The brand announced disgrace to anyone who looked at the face. But the branding was only the beginning of Marjorie's punishment. And this is crucial to understand about medieval justice for accused adulteresses. The punishment was never just one thing. It was always multiple, always public, always designed to destroy the woman physically, socially, economically, and psychologically. The goal was not simply to punish the specific act, which in Marjorie's case had never even been proven to have occurred, but to utterly annihilate the woman as a person, to make her an example so terrifying that every other woman in the community would be paralyzed with fear at the mere thought of stepping on the floor. After the branding, Marjorie was barely conscious from pain and shock. The agony radiating from her cheek was so intense that it seemed to fill her entire head, making it difficult to think or see. The flesh of her cheek was charred black in the center, where the metal had pressed longest, already beginning to blister and swell. Blood mixed with clear fluid oozed from the wound, running down her jaw and dripping onto her dress. The pain was so overwhelming that it dominated every sense, every thought, every moment of existence. But the crowd was not satisfied. They had come for a spectacle, for justice, for entertainment that broke up the monotony of medieval village life. The spectacle had to continue. Under English common law and local custom that had been practiced for generations, a woman convicted of adultery faced multiple forms of punishment, each one designed to humiliate her thoroughly, and to ensure that she would serve as a warning to every other woman. Marjorie was dragged across the square, her feet barely able to move, leaving tracks in the dirt where she slipped. The men hauling her showed no gentleness, no consideration for her pain. She was pulled to the pillory that stood permanently erected in the center of the square, a wooden framework with holes for the head and it held countless people over the years. The wood stained dark from weather, and from the bodily fluid of those pushing off it. The pillory was designed not just to hold the condemned, but to cause them physical suffering, to force the person into an extremely uncomfortable bent-over position that made breathing difficult and caused severe back and neck pain for minutes. The hole in the neck was deliberately small, against the throat, and the hole to the wrist was positioned so that the arms were stretched uncomfortably. Standing in the pillory for even hours at night. Standing for 3 hours, as Marjorie would be required to do.
Did you hear
Form of
that?
torture in itself. Marjorie's neck and wrists were locked into the ice. The wooden bars closed and secured with an iron pin. She was forced to stand bent over at an unnatural angle, her back already beginning to ache, her neck compressed by the wooden collar. A sign was hung around her neck, suspended from a rope so it dangled against her chest, reading in large letters painted in black, "Adulteress and War." The words could be read from across the square, ensuring that anyone who happened to pass by would understand exactly what crime this woman had committed and what category of person she was.
AI can't shred, but it can help tweak tough geometry for faster spin. Find your edge with AI from Google Cloud.
Rifle through rows of relentlessly discounted refrigerators, ranges, dishwashers, laundry sets, and more.
Chevy trucks, Chevy people who drive them. They don't need permission to get it. They all have that little extra something. And maybe you got it too. Chevrolet. Together, let's drive.
Then the real humiliation began. The part that would be seared into Marjorie's memory. The part that would destroy something essential, even if the body survived. In medieval Europe, public punishment was participatory. The crowd was not just supposed to watch passively like modern observers of the criminal proceeding. They were expected to join in actively, to add their own expressions of moral outrage to the official punishment, to demonstrate their own virtue and their own adherence to community values by attacking the condemned. For Marjorie, this meant being pelted with whatever refuse the crowd could find while she was locked in the pillory, unable to defend herself, unable to dodge or escape, forced to stand there and endure whatever they chose to throw. The first projectile was a rotten cabbage, thrown by an old woman who lived 3 houses down from Marjorie, and who had always watched her with suspicious eyes. The cabbage hit Marjorie in the face, spattering across the fresh brand like a sheet, and making her scream again from the renewed agony. The impact drove bits of rotten vegetable into the burn wound, contaminating it with bacteria that would cause a severe infection within hours. Then came a barrage of red, as if Marjorie's scream had been a signal to open the spoiled eggs that had been saved specifically for this purpose, the contents rotten and sulfurous, breaking against her head and running down her face and into her hair. Rotten tomatoes that exploded on her feet, covering her in all cold. Contents of timber pots, thrown from close range by people who aimed carefully to ensure the waste splashed across her face and body. Mud mixed with horse manure, scooped from the streets where horses and oxen had been driven. Small stones, not large enough to cause serious injury. The authorities did not want to kill her, after all, but large enough to hurt when they struck her head and shoulders, opening small cuts that bled down her neck. The crowd jeered and shouted insults with each throw, each person trying to voice the cleverest or most cunning remark. Whore! Faithless woman. Betrayer of your husband, devil's bride, corrupted flesh, Jezebel. The insults were as much a part of the punishment as the physical assault, designed to destroy any remaining sense of dignity or self-worth. Marjorie was not just being hurt physically. She was being told, again and again, by everyone she knew, by her neighbors, acquaintances, people she had lived among her entire life, that she was worthless, that she was less than human, that she deserved this treatment, that she had brought this suffering upon herself through her own wickedness. Children were specifically encouraged to participate, their parents lifting them up to get better angles for throwing or handing them particularly disgusting items to throw at the women they killed. Young boys, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, competed with each other to see who could hit Marjorie with the most disgusting projectiles, laughing and celebrating each successful throw as if it were a game, learning through direct participation that this was proper treatment for women who died. Young girls watched from the edge of the park, their mothers holding their hands or standing beside them with hands on their shoulders, all of them learning what would happen if they ever strayed from absolute obedience to their future husbands, internalizing the message that female virtue must be guarded at all costs because the punishment for failure was complete social destruction. Marjorie stood in the pillory for 3 full hours, from mid-morning
Not gonna
early
get it,
afternoon,
most likely.
the sun climbing higher in the sky and heating the square, and the smell of the refuse covering her living. By the end, she was covered in filth from head to foot, barely recognizable as a human being. Her hair was matted with rotten eggs and excrement. Her dress, which had been cleaned that morning, was soaked with every kind of refuse the village could produce. She was bleeding from where scalp and face. Her neck and back were in agony from being held in an unnatural position for so long. She could barely stand, her legs shaking from exhaustion and pain, only the wooden collar around her neck keeping her from collapsing. The branded cheek was severely infected from the contamination of all the refuse thrown at her. The flesh had swollen to nearly twice its normal size, turning dark purple and green around the edges of the skin. The infection was spreading into the surrounding tissue, creating an abscess that would cause Marjorie intense pain for weeks, and that might, if she was very unlucky, spread to her bloodstream and kill her from sepsis. When she was finally released from the pillory, the bailiff removing the iron pin and lifting the wooden bars, Marjorie collapsed immediately to the muddy ground. She fell forward, landing face first in the accumulated filth that surrounded the pillory, too weak to catch herself and control her fall. She lay there, unable to move, barely conscious, breathing in shallow gasps. The crowd began to disperse, having gotten the entertainment they came for, their duty to community justice fulfilled, heading home to eat dinner and discuss what they had witnessed. But wait, because Marjorie's punishment still was not finished. You might think that after being branded and spending 3 hours in the pillory being pelted with refuse by the entire village, Marjorie had suffered enough to satisfy the requirements of medieval justice. But you would be wrong. Medieval justice operated on multiple principles that demanded more. The principle that shame must be made visible in multiple ways, not just one. The principle that the entire community must participate in transgressor through various rituals that follow traditional practice. The principle that punishment must be memorable enough to serve as a deterrent for years or even decades. That people should be able to say, remember what happened to Marjorie? And have everyone immediately understand the consequences of accused adultery. What came next? To ensure that Marjorie's disgrace followed her for every remaining day of her life, and that everyone who witnessed it would never forget the punishment of being accused of betraying her husband. The next morning, Marjorie was dragged from the cell where she had spent the night lying on a cold stone, still covered in dried filth from the previous day. The wound on her face swollen and hot with infection, her entire body aching from the abuse it had endured. She was taken by the town constable, pulled by ropes tied around her wrists because she could barely walk on her own, to the river that ran along the edge of the village. A crowd was already gathering there, word spread about the adulteress was to undergo the ducking, the traditional water punishment for women who had strayed from virtue. At the river's edge stood a device called a ducking stool, a chair made of rough wood and iron, attached to a long wooden beam, that could be operated like a lever to plunge the occupant repeatedly into the water. Ducking stools were used throughout medieval England and parts of continental Europe, primarily for punishing women, scolds, gossips, brewers accused of selling bad ale, and most commonly, women accused of moral offenses like adultery. The devices were permanent fixtures in many towns, maintained at public expense just like the pillories and the gallows, standing as constant reminders of what could happen to women who violated community norms. The official justification for ducking was that the cold water would cool the hot passions that led women to sin, that immersion in the purifying element would cleanse them of their corruption and restore them to virtue. This explanation was written into legal codes and church teachings, giving the punishment an air of medical and spiritual legitimacy. The root, everyone understood but rarely stated openly, was humiliation and physical torment disguised as correction and purification, another method of breaking the condemned woman physically and psychologically while entertaining the crowd. Marjorie was dragged to the ducking stool and forced into the chair. Her arms were bound to the armrests with leather straps, pulled tight enough to cut into her skin. Her body was secured to the back of the chair with a rope around her waist, tied so she could not escape or even struggle effectively. The chair was designed to prevent the occupant from moving, from protecting themselves in any way, from doing anything but enduring whatever was done to them. The operator of the ducking stool, usually an official or his assistant who was paid a small fee for this service, pulled a lever. The long beam, working like a seesaw with the chair attached to one end, swung out over the river, carrying Marjorie with it. She had just enough time to draw breath and realize what was about to happen before the operator released the lever and the chair plunged down into the water. The shock of the pull was overwhelming, like being struck by a physical blow. It was really strange. The river was fed by sunlight and making the water really cold, perhaps just like freezing. The sudden immersion made Marjorie gasp involuntarily, a reflex she could not control. And she inhaled water into her lungs. She choked and struggled against her bonds, thrashing helplessly in the chair, unable to understand what was happening or how to protect herself. Her lungs burned, her vision darkened at the eyes. She was certain she was dying. But this was how she would die, trapped underwater. That they had decided to execute her after all, just as her consciousness was beginning to fade. Just as she was on the verge of passing out from lack of oxygen, the operator pulled the lever again, and the beam raised her out to water. Marjorie broke the surface, coughing and gasping, water streaming from her hair and clothes, her body shaking violently from the cold. She vomited up the water from her, choking and retching, her throat raw, her chest heaving as she tried to draw breath. But she was given only seconds to catch her breath. Just enough time for the crowd to see her face, to see her terror and suffering. Before the operator released the lever, she plunged underwater again. And again, and again. The ducking continued for 20 plunges, each one taken aloud by the crowd who had gathered on the riverbank and the bridge top, chanting the numbers in unison like spectators at some grotesque sporting event. 1, 2, 3. Each time Marjorie went under, she was held there for longer periods, the operator carefully calibrating her weight to keep herself walking the line between punishment and execution. Each time, coughing with water, her body shaking so violently with cold and terror that the chair rattled against the beam. By the 10th ducking, Marjorie was no longer struggling. She hung limp in the chair between immersions, barely conscious, water pouring from her mouth and nose, flesh raising, her head lolling forward. Her lips had turned blue and cold. Her skin had taken on a grayish color. She looked more like a corpse than a living person. By the 15th ducking, she was no longer making any sound when she came up from the water, just gasping weakly and shaking. Her eyes were unfocused, rolled back in her head. Some in the crowd began to murmur that perhaps this was enough, that perhaps they were going to kill her. that perhaps the punishment was going too far. But the operator continued, following the sentence that had been pronounced. Traditional 20 duckings for indulgence. By the 20th and final ducking, Marjorie appeared more dead than alive. Her skin was blue, cold, and non-toxic. The breathing was shallow and labor. The violent shaking had stopped, replaced by occasional twitches that might have been voluntary movement or might have been death spasms. She was pulled from the stool and laid on the riverbank like a piece of water pouring out the lungs as she was positioned on her side by rough hands that cared nothing for her. The constable kicked her roughly in the ribs to see if she was still alive. She moaned weakly, the sound more animal than human, confirming that she would survive. This was considered a successful punishment, severe enough to remember, to provide a spectacle, to satisfy the community's demand for justice, but not fatal. Dead women could not serve as ongoing examples to witnesses. Dead women could not walk through the village with their brands visible, reminding everyone of the consequences of straying. Marjorie needed to survive, so she could continue to be punished every day of her very existence. The infection of Marjorie's branded cheek had worsened dramatically with immersion in a contaminated river. Medieval rivers were open sewers where all the waste of human civilization accumulated. They were filled with human and animal waste, with the chemicals and byproducts from leather workers who treated hides and tanning pits that drained into the river, with blood and offal from butchers who slaughtered animals on the riverbank and threw the waste into the water, with all manner of refuse and contamination. The bacteria-laden water had infected the burn wounds severely, causing the flesh to swell massively, turning it dark, purple, and green, with streaks of red spreading out across her cheek and jaw that indicated blood poisoning. Marjorie developed a high fever that night, her body's attempt to fight the multiple infections ravaging her system. She spent the next week in bed in a room provided by the church, not out of mercy, but because if she died on the streets, it would create a disposal problem, delirious and close to death, her body fighting infections on multiple fronts. She survived, but the illness and the damage from the punishments changed her fundamentally.
The Clue Anniversary Sale is on now. Save up to 50% on the spring design award-winning furniture. Come home to the future of furniture. Come home to King. Hurry, sale on now. It's refreshing and tastes for just right. Like your average. For Brittany, it's more than a move. It's a new city. It's a new world. It's a brand new horizon that's waiting for the taking. It's more than a move, and we're more than a truck.
The Mega Millions jackpot.
Go on, Janelle. Follow your daydreams.
Oh. I wonder if my grandma.
Interaction lasted while he waited for him to come out. He testified that nothing improper had occurred, that he had never touched Marjorie, had never spoken to her about anything except bread and pain, that the conversations had been brief and hot. But once accused by her husband, Marjorie had no effective way to defend herself against the charge. Medieval law in most of Europe operated on assumptions that made defense nearly impossible for accused women. The assumption that a husband's honor was without overwhelming evidence. The assumption that protecting male reputation was more important than establishing truth. The assumption that it was better to punish a possibly innocent woman than to allow a guilty one to escape, or to embarrass a husband by suggesting his accusation might be false. The assumption that women were naturally deceptive and prone to lying about their own behavior, so their testimony about their innocence could not be trusted. The system was designed to make defense nearly impossible once an accusation was made. In most medieval courts, women could not testify on their own behalf in cases involving their own supposed moral failings. This legal principle, written into law codes throughout Christian Europe, held that a woman's testimony about her own virtue was inherently unreliable because women were believed to be naturally inclined to deception in order to protect themselves. The only testimony that mattered was from the accuser, the husband, and from witnesses who claimed to have seen suspicious behavior. The standard of proof was not beyond reasonable doubt in the modern sense, but simply suspicion based on appearance of impropriety. This meant that a woman could be convicted and brutally punished, based solely on having been seen talking to a man who was not her husband, on having smiled at someone, on having been insufficiently modest in her dress or behavior, on having failed to immediately report to her husband every interaction with another male. The system ensured that accusations almost inevitably led to convictions, and that convictions led to devastating punishments. The punishments destroyed not just the woman's body, but her entire social existence. Marjorie's husband, Thomas, divorced her through the ecclesiastical courts on grounds of adultery, which was automatically granted given Marjorie's conviction in the secular court. The divorce left Marjorie with no support, no property, and no legal protection. Under medieval law throughout most of Europe, when a marriage was dissolved due to the wife's adultery, the husband kept all marital property. This included not just property the couple had acquired during the marriage, but even the dowry that Marjorie's family had provided when she married, which was supposed to be her security. Thomas took everything: the house, the furnishings, the money, the goods. Marjorie was left literally with nothing except the filthy dress she had been wearing during her punishments. She could not work in any respectable trade. No one would hire a woman branded on the face as an adulteress. The brand was specifically designed to make her unemployable, to ensure she could never rebuild a normal life. She could not work as a servant in any respectable household because her presence would corrupt.
Why are you in my room?
Or so people believed. Morality.
Why are you in my room?
Both virtue and vice spread from person to person through association. A branded adulteress in a household would contaminate the virtue of local servants, or so the reasoning went. She could not work with other women in textile production, the most common form of women's work, because the other women refused to associate with her, claiming she would corrupt them, or that they could not be seen associating with such a woman without damaging their own reputations. The only work available to her was the most degrading and dangerous: collecting refuse from the streets, cleaning latrines, perhaps selling her body, though even in that profession her brand made her less desirable than unmarked women. The irony was not lost on anyone, least of all Marjorie herself. She had been branded as a whore for allegedly committing adultery. Now the only way she could survive was to actually become what she had been falsely accused. She could not attend church without people whispering and pointing. The priest would not allow her to take communion or to participate in any of the sacraments, marking her as outside the community of Christian souls. She was not quite formally excommunicated, but she was effectively excluded from full participation in Christian religious life, which in medieval Europe meant she was excluded from the most important aspects of community belonging. Children would follow her in the streets, chanting, "Adulteress, adulteress," in mocking sing-song voices, throwing small stones or mud at her. Adults would spit at her when she passed or throw things, repeating the violence of the public punishment on a smaller scale every day. She was effectively exiled while remaining physically in the same town, isolated among people she had known her entire life. After 6 months of this existence, of being unable to find work, of surviving on scraps and occasional coins from people who took pity on her, of sleeping in abandoned buildings or under hedges because no one would rent her a room, Marjorie left the village. She hoped that perhaps in another place where no one knew her history, where no one had witnessed her emotions, she might be able to start over, to find some kind of life. But the brand on her face made this impossible. The brand was specifically designed to be permanent, to be immediately recognizable, to announce to anyone who saw exactly what crime the girl had committed. In every town and village Marjorie entered, people saw the blade burned into her cheek and knew immediately that names of brands were standardized across much of Europe. A for adulteress, T for thief, H for heretic, and so on. The brands were designed to be a permanent mark that followed the criminal forever, preventing them from escaping their past and starting over. Marjorie was driven away from town after town, sometimes with threats, sometimes with actual violence. In one village, men threw stones at her until she fled. In another, she was dragged before the local magistrate, who ordered her to leave immediately on pain of being whipped. In a third, women surrounded her and beat her with sticks, accusing her of trying to kill her. She survived by begging on the road between settlements, sleeping in ditches or abandoned buildings, eating whatever scraps she could find. She learned to approach people carefully, her head down, her cheek turned away, trying to get them to give her something before they saw the mark and understood what she was. Sometimes this worked. Sometimes she could beg a piece of bread or a few coins before people knew. More often, she decided to leave immediately and drove her away. The chronic illness from her punishments weakened her progressively. Her repeated near drownings had caused permanent damage to her lungs. She developed a persistent cough that worsened with each passing month, especially in cold and damp weather. She would cough until she vomited, until blood came up with the cough, her body trying desperately to clear lungs that would never fully heal. The infection from the brain had spread through the left side of her face, causing permanent damage to nerves and tissue. She was left with chronic pain that never fully went away, a constant aching and burning sensation in her cheek and jaw. The left side of her face was partially paralyzed, making it difficult to eat or speak clearly. The scarring frozen her into a permanent grimace on that side. 2 years after her conviction, in the winter of 1344, Marjorie died at age 33. Her body was found in a ditch beside a road between two small villages, frozen and partially covered with snow. She had been dead for several days before anyone found her. The local authorities in the nearest village were notified. They sent men to collect the body, which they buried in an unmarked grave in unconsecrated ground at the edge of the churchyard, the area reserved for criminals, suicides, and others deemed unworthy of proper Christian burial. Her death was recorded in the parish register as simply an adulterous woman found dead on the roadside, buried outside the churchyard wall. No name, no mention of family, no suggestion that she had ever been a person with a life and identity beyond her crime. This was Marjorie's life, accused based on thin evidence, convicted in a court where she could not defend herself, brutally punished in ways designed to destroy her completely, divorced, and left destitute, driven from place to place, dying alone in a ditch, and buried without ceremony in an unmarked grave. And her story was not unusual. This was normal. This was what happened to thousands of women throughout medieval Europe who were accused of adultery. But when Holmes told us what we need to understand before we return to Eleanor in her sealed cell is that Marjorie's punishment was actually one of the milder ones that medieval society used to accuse adulteresses. She survived the punishment. She lived for 2 more years. Some women were not so lucky. Some women faced fate so much worse that Marjorie's suffering seems almost bearable by comparison. Now let me tell you about Isabella, because Isabella's story will show you how noble women faced different but equally terrible punishments. And because Isabella's fate is part of understanding what was waiting for Eleanor in that cell beneath the castle, Isabella was 24 years old, 1326. respected nobody. She was 14, the Baron Jeffrey Devon, a wealthy landowner who was 42 at the time of the marriage, and who needed heirs to continue his line. The marriage was purely political and economic, the union of two powerful families in the States, arranged by Isabella's father Jeffrey without any consideration for the 14-year-old Isabella, or whether Isabella had any say in it. In medieval noble society, brothers were also traded, and their preferences were irrelevant. Jeffrey was not a kind husband. He was not particularly cruel by the standards of his class and time, but he was cold, distant, focused primarily on his estates and his political position at the Burgundian court. He spent most of his time managing his lands, hunting with his children, and tending to the burden. Isabella lived in Jeffrey's castle with minimal companionship, except for servants and Jeffrey's household staff. Basic reading in French and Latin, elementary religious instruction, training in household management and needlework. These conversations were a revelation, an opening into a world of ideas she had never known before. For Pierre, Isabella was an intelligent and sympathetic listener, in a world where most nobility treated priests as little more than servants. Their friendship was based on genuine intellectual companionship and mutual respect, something rare in medieval society where most relationships were defined by family and social utility. The friendship was completely innocent, at least initially. They never touched. They never spoke of anything in common. Their conversations were always in public spaces: the library, the chapel, the castle garden, where servants were present and could observe them. They discussed ideas, not feelings, philosophy, not attraction. But the friendship looked suspicious to others in the household who observed them spending hours together, talking with obvious enthusiasm. Isabella laughed at their observations, and then she never laughed at Jeffrey, serving, perhaps hoping to get a favor with Jeffrey, perhaps genuinely believing something create drama, reported to Jeffrey that his wife spent inappropriate amounts of time alone in the chapel. The word alone was technically false. Servants were present, but in the medieval mind, a married woman spending extended time with a man who was not her husband in any context was suspicious. Jeffrey's adult son from his first marriage, a man named Robert, who was actually older than Isabella, and who stood to inherit Jeffrey's entire estate, unless Isabella bore sons who obtained precedence, seized on this report with enthusiasm. Robert had resented Isabella from the moment she married. He saw her as a threat to his inheritance. As a young woman who might yet bear sons who would disgrace him to his respected position. Now, he had an opportunity to destroy her, to eliminate the threat she represented by convincing his father that Isabella was an adulteress who needed to be removed. Robert went to Jeffrey and told him that rumors were circulating among the servants, and even among Jeffrey's noble peers, that Jeffrey was being made a fool of in his own castle, that whispers and knowing looks followed Jeffrey wherever he went, that his honor as a lord and husband demanded immediate and decisive action to stop the gossip and restore his reputation. Jeffrey confronted Isabella, confused and frightened by her husband's unusual behavior. Jeffrey was normally cold and controlled, insisted that the relationship with Pierre was completely chaste, that they had only discussed books and ideas, that nothing improper had ever occurred, that she had always behaved with complete propriety. Jeffrey did not believe her, or perhaps he did believe her, but chose to act as if he did not, because accusing her of adultery served his purposes in multiple ways. It gave him an excuse to get rid of a wife who had failed to produce the heir he wanted after 10 years of marriage. It allowed him to retain the substantial dowry Isabella's family had provided, which would revert to Jeffrey if the marriage was dissolved due to Isabella's fight. It demonstrated his authority and decisiveness to his peers, and it protected his honor by showing that he was man enough to control his household and punish an errant wife. But here's where the story reveals how trapped noblemen were in medieval society, how they faced different but equally terrible punishments than common. Jeffrey could not simply brand Isabella or subject her to the brutal public punishments of Isabella's family was too powerful, connected to other noble houses throughout Burgundy and beyond. If Jeffrey openly harmed Isabella in ways that left visible scars or that resulted in her death, he would create a blood feud with the relatives, potentially leading to private war between the families, to raids on each other's estates, to a cycle of violence and revenge that could continue for generations. But even nobility had to be careful about their neglect between these family members, because violence against one member of the noble family could trigger obligations of revenge that destroyed delicate web of marriages that held noble society together. So Jeffrey chose a different method, one that was legal throughout Christian law, religious for centuries by the church, and that would turn and remove Isabella's while avoiding direct violence. He announced that Isabella would be sent to a convent for spiritual correction and penance. This sounds relatively benign to modern hearers, almost gentle.
Dad, we have a wasp.
Huh?
We have a wasp.
Where?
It's on the floor by the plants.
A wasp?
Yes, crawling on the floor.
Separated from a word against her will, her property and inheritance forfeited to Jeffrey. Her legal existence and the convent Jeffrey chose was not a comfortable establishment for noble daughters, but a harsh penitentiary, specifically designed to house women whose families wanted them disappeared. The convent was in a remote area.
Do you see it?
No.
Accessible only by
I know I saw it.
isolated from other settlements, a place where women could be locked away and forgotten. It was known throughout the region.
I know it was there.
Its strict enclosure, for its accepting women sent there for punishment rather than
I'm scared.
asking them
I'm
questions.
scared, and I need to try. I'm scared of it.
Isabella was seen rounds from the bed without warning, not allowed to have possession.
I'm gonna go to the bathroom.
Wait, hold on before you watch it.
You just made me fail a skill check.
No, put the seat down.
Eat zucchini. Eat zucchini. Do you read me? The what? Eat zucchini. I'm getting out of here. Eat zucchini. Eat zucchini. Gonna go MIA. MIA. I'm going MIA. 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 It sounds like I'm singing. My heart gave mistakes. Is it dead? Well, I need to charge.
About burying her alive, where she could never trouble Jeffrey again. Isabella was locked in a cell, barely 6 feet long, stone walls and stone floor. A single small window set high in the wall.
I'm just gonna guess it's dead.
The window was buried in a foot square, covered with iron bars, positioned too high for Isabella to look out and see anything but a small patch of sky. The cell contained a wooden with no mattress or blankets, just the hard wood. A bucket and a funnel served as a latrine, next to one side of the bed. That was all. No chair, no table, no possessions of any kind. She was given one meal a day, delivered to her front in the door. The meal consisted of a piece of bread, sometimes a thin soup she was offered, and a cup of water. This was barely enough to sustain her, intentionally insufficient to keep her in a state of weakness and chronic hunger, but constant malnutrition too weak to resist, too weak to cause trouble. Slowly breaking her down over the years, she would allow herself only to attend religious services, which occurred 7 times throughout each day and night, following the traditional monastic schedule, matins at midnight, laws at dawn, prime at 6 in the morning, terce at 9, sex at noon, none at 3 in the afternoon, vespers at sunset, and compline before bed. These services, which were spiritually meaningful for someone who had chosen religious life, became a form of torture for Isabella, disrupting sleep continuously and ensuring constant
Hey,
exhaustion.
Dad.
During these services,
Oh,
Isabella
were you awake when about the about the insult things?
confess her adultery publicly.
I don't know.
The other
You don't look at me when you
few
talk.
other
I know.
I don't know. Never mind.
She had to say in a loud voice, I, Isabella, confess before God and this holy community that I am an adulteress, that I betrayed my husband, that I corrupted my soul through wickedness, that I deserve the punishment that I received. If she refused to speak these words, or if she tried to protest her innocence, she was beaten with rods by other men, even long enough for which she normally received until she cried. The worst part of her confinement was not the physical suffering, but the isolation. Isabella was forbidden from speaking to any of the other women in the convent. Some of their families for various supposed crimes were kept separated from each other, and from the nuns who had taken vows by choice. Isabella could see other people during services, could hear their voices, but she was not allowed to communicate. If she tried to speak to anyone, she was beaten and returned to her cell for days without being allowed to leave the convent for services. She was not allowed to receive letters or visitors. She was cut off completely from the outside world, from her family, from anyone who had known her before. She had no way of knowing what was happening in the world beyond her. If her family had tried to intervene on her behalf, if Pierre, the chaplain, had been punished or deported, she was buried alive in a stone cell in the mountains, forgotten by everyone except Jeffrey, who had the satisfaction of knowing his honor had been defended if his problematic wife had been eliminated without the mess of execution. Isabella lived for 23 years before she died at age 47. 23 years. More than 2 decades locked in a cell barely large enough to lie down in, fed one minimal meal per day, allowed to speak to no one, cut off from every person she had ever known, with no hope of release, no possibility of appeal, no way to prove her innocence, or to be heard by anyone who might help her. She never saw her family again. Her father had died within 5 years of her imprisonment, never knowing what had become of his daughter and not being told she was being killed. Her younger siblings, who had been children when she was taken, grew up barely remembering, told only that their sister had committed a terrible sin and was being punished for it. She never learned what happened to Pierre, the chaplain, who had been sent away from Jeffrey's service immediately after the accusation and who disappeared from the historical record, probably fleeing to another region to avoid being charged as Isabella's accomplice, changing his name, perhaps abandoning the priesthood entirely to avoid questions about his past. She spent more than 2 decades confined to a few square feet of snow, praying the same prayers over and over, fasting until her body was skeletal, insisting to God, if not to her captors, that she had done nothing wrong.
Chevy trucks are as dependable as the Chevy people who drive them. They don't need permission to get going. They all have that little extra something. And maybe you got that's right.
I love you, Dad.
The isolation and harsh conditions broke her health. She developed illnesses from the cold.
Houston, I'm gonna.
combined with exhausted prisoners who had already survived starvation, disease, and the daily violence of the camps. None of them told me where they were being taken or why. They only knew one thing. People did not return to prison unless SS tried to keep hidden. Inside, guards waited with lists already prepared. The women chosen were told they had been selected for a special mission, an assignment the SS claimed would give them. They were taken from their barracks without warning, pulled from lines of exhausted prisoners who had already survived starvation, disease, and the daily violence of the camps. None of them told where they were being taken or why. They only knew one thing. People did not return to the building SS tried to keep hidden. Inside, guards waited with lists already prepared. The women chosen an assignment the SS claimed would give them better food, cleaner beds, and a chance at surviving a system designed to destroy them. What they were not told was that this assignment was part of a secret program created at the highest levels of the Nazi regime, a system built to control prisoners, manipulate their desperation, and turn survival itself into a bargain. For decades, almost no one outside the camps knew this existed. Even many survivors never learned the full extent of it. Records were burned, testimonies were signed, and this part of the dark machinery remained hidden behind the horrors of the war. This is the story of Nazi concentration camp pleasure houses, how they were built, who was forced into them, and why the system remained in the shadows for more than 60 years. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, the Nazi regime set in motion a transformation that would reshape every aspect of German society. The outbreak of war meant the mobilization of millions of men, the restructuring of the economy for total war production, and the rapid expansion of territories under German occupation. Within months of the invasion, German military forces had swept across Poland and were preparing for operations in Western Europe. By 1940, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and France had fallen under Nazi control. The German Wehrmacht seemed unstoppable. The occupied territories stretched from the Atlantic coast to the borders of the Soviet Union. This unprecedented military expansion created challenges that the Nazi leadership had not fully anticipated. Millions of German soldiers found themselves stationed far from home, in occupied territories across Europe. The separation from normal social life, from families, from the routines of civilian existence began to take its toll. Wehrmacht commanders observed signs of declining morale among troops who spent months or years in foreign lands with limited contact with German society. The Nazi military leadership understood that morale was not merely a matter of comfort, it was a strategic concern. Soldiers who were dissatisfied, homesick, or emotionally isolated might problems. They might drink excessively, engage in behavior that antagonized local populations, or lose the aggressive edge that the regime demanded of its fighting forces. To address this concern, the Wehrmacht established entertainment facilities in occupied territories. These included bars, and establishments where criminals could interact with women. The regime carefully organized these facilities, ensuring they were staffed by women deemed racially acceptable according to Nazi ideology. Wehrmacht officers viewed this as a practical matter of maintaining military effectiveness and preventing behavior that might undermine German authority in occupied regions. Within Germany, the concentration was expanding.
universe of groups the Nazis considered socially undesirable, and increasingly, people from occupied territories. By 1942, the camp population had swelled to unprecedented numbers, and the SS was struggling to manage this enormous captive labor force. In this context, one SS officer saw an opportunity to apply the same logic that the Wehrmacht had used for its troops to the concentration camp system. His name was Oswald Paul, and he would become the architect of one of the most disturbing innovations in the already. Oswald Paul was not a household name, even within the Nazi hierarchy. He did not give fiery speeches or lead dramatic military campaigns. Instead, he was a bureaucrat, a man who excelled at organization, logistics, and the efficient management of resources. In February 1942, Paul received an appointment that would give him enormous power over the concentration camp system. He became the head of the SS main economic and administrative office, known by its German acronym as the WEHA. This position made Paul responsible for the economic exploitation of concentration camp prisoners. Under his authority, prisoners would be worked to death in armaments factories, construction projects, and industrial enterprises that generated profits for the SS and supported the German war economy. With a mindset of profit management, seeking to maximize productivity and minimize waste. But Paul's vision extended beyond simply working through He understood that maintaining control over such a large and diverse prisoner population required more than brutality and terror. It required sophisticated of manipulation, creating incentives, establishing hierarchies, and offering rewards that prisoners would compete to obtain. In early 1942, Paul drafted a memorandum that he submitted to his superior, Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer SS, and one of the most powerful figures in Nazi Germany. In this document, Paul outlined his proposal for a new system that would serve multiple purposes. It would provide a reward mechanism that could be used to incentivize prisoner productivity and compliance. It would help establish and reinforce hierarchies among prisoners, making some feel privileged while others remained excluded. And it would give camp administrators another tool for gathering intelligence, as prisoners might be willing to inform on others in exchange for access to privileges. The proposal was coldly calculated. Paul argued that male prisoners, like soldiers, experienced physical needs that, if left unaddressed, could lead to behavioral problems or decreased work efficiency. He suggested that by offering access to women as a reward for cooperation and productivity, the SS could create a powerful incentive structure. Prisoners who informed on escape plans, who exceeded work quotas, or who served the country authority in various capacities could be granted this privilege. Heinrich Himmler reviewed Paul's proposal with interest. Himmler was known for his obsession with control, his belief in using every possible method to maintain SS authority, and his willingness to implement systems that other Nazi leaders might have found distasteful. He saw the potential in Paul's plan. After careful consideration, he gave his approval. With Himmler's endorsement secured, Oswald Paul moved quickly to implement his system. He approached the project with characteristic thoroughness, treating it as he would any other administrative challenge. Every aspect was carefully planned, measured, and optimized for efficiency. In June 1942, Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria. Mauthausen was one of the most notorious camps in the Nazi system, known for its brutal stone quarries where prisoners were worked to death under savage conditions. It was here that Paul chose to test his new system. The SS approached the establishment of this facility with meticulous planning. They calculated ratios, how many women would be needed to serve how many men. They determined what they considered the optimal age range for women's selection. They designed the physical layout of the facility, deciding how many rooms would be needed to maintain continuous operations. Every detail was quantified